Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero. We have two guests joining Pete on the show today. Dr. John Sullivan is an adjunct researcher at the Vortex Foundation in Bogota, Colombia, a senior research fellow at CAST, that's the Center for Advanced Studies on Terrorism. His doctoral thesis was Mexico's Drug War, Cartels, Gangs, Sovereignty, and the Network State. His current research focus is the impact of transnational organized crime on sovereignty in Mexico and other countries. Dr. Sullivan completed the CREATE executive program in counterterrorism at USC and has been a career police officer, currently a lieutenant with the LA County Sheriff's Office. U.S. Army retired Major John Spencer currently serves as the chair of urban warfare studies at the Modern War Institute at West Point. He was an enlisted soldier in the infantry for 8 years, reached the rank of Sergeant First Class before attending OCS. He did 2 deployments to Iraq as an infantry platoon leader and a company commander, and he retired in 2018. He has written for the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Wired Magazine, and he has been on the Break It Down show with us also several times. We're proud to have them both and to hear this rare and deep discussion on the growing importance of urban warfare in our engagements across the globe. Please enjoy our guests today, Dr. John Sullivan and Major John W. Spencer.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay Moore.
This is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick Marotta.
This is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hi, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
This is John Spencer from the Modern War Institute.
Good morning. This is Dr. John Sullivan. I'm a senior fellow with the Small Wars Journal, and you're listening to the Break It Down Show.
And now, the Break It Down Show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we're going to get heady and smart. John Sullivan's, of course, new to the show. Thank you so much for coming on and talking to us, Dr. Sullivan. And then, of course, John Spencer has been on the show several times talking about modern conflict. And, the audience always loves these strategy-based theory shows on what fights look like. We talk about the ground truth a lot, but we also got to talk about the theory so that we can link the two together. And I know specifically that Spencer, as an infantry guy at heart, appreciates, it's great to say, hey, we're going to, strategically create this impact, but on the ground, what is that? We're going to win this war. And they're like, hey, Lieutenant Spencer, here's 5,000 pamphlets you need to hand out.
Oh, yeah.
God damn it. How am I supposed to win the war? Yeah. So I thought, fellas, what we would do is examine the future. Let's back up before we do that, and we'll get into the feral city concept. But let's look at 2030, 2040, the all of the things that we're all sort of worried about, whether it's global climate change or mega cities and multi-dimensional combat and just old-fashioned tanks smashing over things. Let's sort of look at what it looks like 10, 20 years down the line, knowing that we'll get all of this wrong. But I think this is part of the fascinating conversation that guys like us have. Before we do any of that, because we know John Spencer already and his work at the Modern War Institute, Dr. Sullivan, why don't you give us a real quick, 30 seconds to 2 minutes on what you do. And by the way, it's super impressive. And then we'll get into feral cities.
Sure. I'm a retired lieutenant. I served 31 years with the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. The bulk of my career was engaged in counterterrorism intelligence. I worked counterterrorism intelligence at 3 ranks as a deputy, a sergeant, and a lieutenant. I was a tactical planning lieutenant for Los Angeles County, running operations ranging from counter riot to disaster response in the field and in the Sheriff's Department Operations Center at the County Emergency Operations Center. I've worked extensively with defense support to civil authorities back from the days when they called it military support to civil authorities. As a founding member of the Interagency Board, which was set up by the Secretary of the Army and the Attorney General of the United States back in '98 to deal with civil-military interoperability for catastrophic terrorism. Worked on a number of advisory roles for a number of national laboratories looking at public safety, police interoperability with the military for catastrophic terrorism, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear. and have traveled a bit around the world consulting with foreign military and police services.
Yeah, that's a lot of stuff. Holy shit!
Well, that's the top line.
That's the top line.
Makes me feel really young, which is nice.
Yeah. You're just barely retired. You're not even good at being retired yet.
No, I'm not. I got the beard going though.
Yeah, you do have the beard going. And then Sullivan, I wanted to point out: have you been watching either Chernobyl or Hot Zone at all?
No, I haven't. Although I'm familiar with both incidents in their initial iteration and have studied both of them rather widely.
We should have you come back and watch those things, and that's because that's as close as we can, off the top of my head, get to those things that you just talked about, learning about nuclear, biological, chemical. I mean, there's two of those things are accounted for right there in those two incidents. That, boy, we as much as you can dodge a bullet in a near nuclear meltdown, we really dodged a bullet in both cases.
Yeah, we certainly did. Going back to those, earlier incidents, the discussion we're having now about the future of urban warfare is not new. In fact, I first got engaged in looking at urban warfare back in the mid 90s when the Marine Corps was looking at ways to deal with the urban littoral interface. And those discussions were really the foundation of a lot of work that kind of got subsumed, not eliminated, but became the foundation of the domestic weapons of mass destruction counterterrorism responses that came after 9/11. But to give you a convergence, I'll just jump on to hit a facet that I didn't discuss in my brief overview. Is a lot of my work post 9/11 was obviously dealing with terrorism, building intelligence, and building intelligence for civil military interoperability and early warning, but also did a large amount of work starting in about 2006 dealing with what I call criminal insurgency, based upon Steve Metz at the Army War College's work on commercial insurgency, expanding that into Mexico, and actually did my doctoral dissertation on Mexican drug cartels and gangs and their impact on sovereignty, and looked at a lot of the issues faced with dealing with building a police-military interface in that type of situation.
I heard that Mexican gangs were not a problem at all on TV the other day, so I'm just going to go with that plan. So
good luck with that.
Right. Yes. Okay. So let's first, Spencer, can you describe for us, so we all know as in the audience, what the heck a feral city is?
Oh yeah. So I'll give it a shot. Actually, I go around talking. For some reason, that term is repulsive to a few communities in which I've talked to, which is really weird, because if you study urban studies or international relations, it's kind of a common term. Most people recognize the term failed state. You can do whole courses in political sciences about failed states and nation state constructs, which is you talked about theory. All the theories of that we hold are nation state theories. Well, there's a professor, and he probably wasn't the first one to come out with it, but he's the one attributed to it, Robert Norton out of the War College, who wrote a paper about feral cities being, and he has a pretty detailed definition of a city of over 1 million that basically the nation has no rule of law over. So not saying it's self-governed, because there's plenty of power forces within a feral city, but so it's a city of over 1 million that basically is no longer governed by the state. The barely any state provided essential services. So it's not what you would call anarchy, but it's a very bad place where rule of law is not there. There are different power structures, and there are a few that he mentions in this paper about it. But Mogadishu, Somalia is probably the most, especially the military community that can recognize that after the civil war in the 90s, Somalia, Mogadishu turned into a feral city. So the different power factions began to establish their own rules of law and who could have what, and started taking control of all the essential services and using that for power. That's in a general term what a feral city is. And there are many around the globe that are. There's a thing called fragility index. So nobody wants their own city called feral, especially if you're at the nation state level. But there are plenty, especially in the developing world, that are either already feral or well on their way to becoming feral because of the global trends that we see. And you talked about 2030, the global trends that we see going in the future. They're mind blowing, Pete. And I tell almost every time I go to talk, I kind of throw out the numbers, and they're almost so crazy that most people can't even wrap their head around them. So, 2030, which is less than, just over 10 years from now, the UN reports, which is the most probably credible people that keep figures on this stuff, that 2/3 of the world will be urban. And that in cities of over 1 million or in the underdeveloped world will double in that time. 180,000 people move to a city per day. And that's insane, since I grew up in most of us grow up in cities here in the United States that aren't even 180,000. A lot of us do. But so the figure of 2/3, or, we were over 50,000 or 50% urban as the globe, so I call us an urban species now. But that number, even in itself, is crazy because it factors in Africa and large portions of the globe that are just not inhabited. Most of the developed world's over 80% urban today. And what I always, urban is not bad. So urbanization in and of itself is not bad. Most of the time urban, post-industrial revolution, urban areas were synonymous with economic growth, with technology, all that. But it's the explosion of population growth and movement to underdeveloped cities that's the kind of what all of us are worrying about, is literally the making process of feral cities, mega cities. There are slums in India that are hundreds of thousands of people, and these are just shanty towns. 1 in 6 people live in a slum in India, and that's insane. But most people don't understand just this population growth that we've had, and how it's reshaping. War is what what I deal with. John deals with or John Sullivan, the entire spectrum. But just that single fact of population growth and urbanization is changing our world. And for some reason, you've had me on before, and I can go on for a while on this. Last figure. So between 1950 and 2000 and today, or 2015, our world's urban population went from 750 million to 4.2 billion.
Wow.
Is that insane?
That's insane. Yeah.
So what I tell you and me, ground truth, what I tell the military people is, why do you continue to think that you're going to fight anywhere but urban? Because in 10 years, in 30 years, it's more sci-fi. Go find a piece of ground that's not urban and then have a fight. You're going to be looking for a piece of ground.
Yeah. Wow. And what's more complex than an urban fight, right? Like a piece of ground can be 40 pieces of ground stacked on each other, and trying to figure out how to.
Yeah. I hope we go there, Pete, because what I also tell people is that, one army entering an urban area that doesn't have any people in it, it's just what we call military operations on urban terrain. That means you're fighting and people are hiding in buildings.
Right.
Bad guys are.
Yeah.
And I really, most urban battles, all I'm going to do is destroy every building until I find you.
Yeah.
But I also showed, the population figures are astronomical. And so we also assume that we're going to get everybody out of a city before we start destroying it. It ain't going to happen.
Yeah.
So
you and I have both,
because
you and I have both been part of, large scale cordon and searches. A cordon and search is when you surround the city and say, anybody that doesn't want to die better get out. And then you go into the city, and there's all kinds of people in there that are like, we're too scared to move. We're a family, whatever.
Yep.
You will constantly find people, and everybody's done everything they can to say, get out. It's not safe. There's about to be a fight, and people still stay.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, in America, it's because they don't want to leave their pets.
Right. Yes.
We tell people to get out, and they're like, most of those, battles, some of the ones we're talking about, they stay for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons is that they know if they leave that piece of home, they leave their home, they basically lost all rights to that home. When they come back, it's probably not going to be theirs.
Yeah.
So that's one of the major reasons. I mean, there's lots of reasons. One of them, they just can't get out, the sick and the elderly. But yeah, I don't know of any urban battle in history where they have been successful in getting all civilians out. I mean, we could talk about Maui. Most people don't understand, the battle just a few years ago that happened in Maui in the Philippines. It's a city of 200,000, and they got 90% of the population out, which is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
So the governor called a state of emergency, and they emptied it, and then had a fight and basically destroyed it. And it's still not populated 2 years later.
Yeah, which brings about the other point with these kind of fights. I mean, Raqqa was a big city, and that population has been forever scattered to the wind. Maybe that wind took them to Europe, different parts of it. Maybe it brought them here to the States. But these people don't go back primarily to where they're from because there's nothing there. Mosul and how destroyed it is. We just had Dan Gabriel on, and if you guys haven't seen his documentary, you want to get reality as to what happens when we leave an area. Like, look, you don't want to spend $5 trillion fixing somebody else's country, but then you have to be able to watch Mosul and the movie that Dan made and go, yeah, I'm cool with ISIS doing that to people, because you don't get to have both things. You don't get to have all this.
No, it's a great movie.
Yeah. Oh, you've seen it?
Yeah, I downloaded it off Amazon.
Yeah. That's the cost right there. Like, we have these things we want to help with, and the problems once you get there, all those refugees, and I'm just saying Raqqa, fill in the blank place, where people are just sort of left to restart lives midstream. So this is why they don't leave. They're like, this is all we have. If we leave this, we are refugees. We may never come back. We may never see it's terrifyingly hard. Dr. Sullivan, when I say to you feral cities, what do you think? What do you want to add to what John Spencer just said?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'll point out the concept of feral cities is controversial, and I'll try to explain some of the reasons why. I think I will get there by going to some of the earlier background. The concept of feral cities didn't just start with Richard Norton's work. And his work was actually, seminal in the sense that he gave it a name, and he actually helped, provide a definition to understand what we were seeing. But others had looked at the concept of urban fragility, conflict in the urban space before. I mean, I go back to Ralph Peters in the 90s talking, about, our cities, their cities, our soldiers, looking into how you understand the human train, the coming human train of conflict, anticipating a lot of what we're seeing. But for Norton, the feral city basically became a place where the rule of law had eroded to the point where the capacity of the government to govern was challenged, compromised, or in some cases almost absent. And Norton himself realized there was a scale, because no one city is the same. They're all different, and they're all different over periods of time. And a conflict in a city is going to vary depending upon what period of time you get there. And it's not just the battle occurs 3 days and it's gone in the world we live in now. It's a ongoing spectrum of conflict. So basically, Norton came up with 3 levels of a feral city: a green city that there was really limited erosion to the functions of government and the bonds between the government and the people. So you can even start to see some kind of Clausewitzian dimensions to this. A yellow fragile city where you started to have a marginal erosion of those bonds, and then a red city where it started to become feral. That scares some people. It scares some people because, particularly when you talk about cities, it creates fear. People sometimes, from a political dimension, that's where a lot of the controversy comes. People fear that the military will then intervene in the city, not recognizing that most militaries don't want to operate in cities because they're inherently complex. They're going to be, as John Spencer pointed out, almost impossible to avoid. We're not going to be able to choose where we fight. We're going to have to fight where our adversary chooses to fight. And if the world is urban, we're going to be there. Dr. Robert Bunker and I, Dr. Bunker's a colleague of mine over at Small Wars Journal. We wrote an article, I think it was in 2011, building upon the work of Norton on feral cities. We called it Integrating Feral Cities and Third Phase Cartel, Third Generation Gang Research, the rise of criminal narco city networks in Black Fork. I think the networks will become important, if not in this discussion, in a follow-on. We added 2 more levels to Norton's initial analysis: a purple city that became fully feral, and there you start to have new governments emerge, and they're not the original state, but they're the new state. And then a black feral city, we call that beyond feral, where you had a criminal city, which is kind of the urban analog to a mafia state or a narco state, where essentially the gangsters, criminals become the functioning government. That's kind of a template. They have a spectrum. And fragility, I think, John Spencer laid out, fragility is probably a good way to look at it. But I would say that the initial research talks about ungoverned areas or areas with no governance. I'm not sure that's actually true. The areas of limited statehood, the areas of contested sovereignty, but someone does govern. It just may not be the state. It may be criminal bands. It may be a warlord. It may be a combination. It may be, in the case of a mafia state, where you have a symbiotic relationship between gangsters and the state or factions of the state. So when you look at how do you operate in that type of area, the intelligence assessment's a lot more complicated than, good guy, bad guy.
Yeah.
It's not just red and blue. You have a spectrum of operators. You have a number of people that may be impediments to your goals. You have a number of people that are essentially neutral or non-combatants that are victims of the situation. You have non-governmental organizations that are filling the void that the state couldn't provide. You have corrupt actors that may change affinity and alliance from time to time, so you're not exactly sure who's who. You have state forces, and obviously, if you look at a place like Mexico and parts of Brazil, the favelas in Brazil right now, you have criminal bands essentially wearing uniforms, driving marked cars, armed and providing social goods. So I think where it becomes really complicated is you start to see the fragile city, the feral city, which is one that's obviously the other governed have turned to the criminal side. You start to see challengers to the state that may be transitioning to new state forms.
Yeah.
I think that's why it scares people.
Well, it's a big problem because when we look at these things, it's very easy to have an institutional stability focused point of view. And I would say from my own experience working in areas, there's no doubt that there is an informal government structure that the locals would consider formal. I have talked to any number of people that handle crime up to and including murder in the tribal system or through the informal system, and they don't want to use a traditional rule of law. We see that as a lack of rule of law. They see that as actually as rule of law. So there's this perception that somehow that system is inferior to the system that we have, and ultimately what often happens is that we end up becoming the insurgent force because we're trying to undermine a government without any real buy-in from the people that are there, because the official government there is at best fledgling, if not struggling to maintain legitimacy. So it is really hard. And then it gets harder still when you bring that point of view in, because these feral cities wouldn't call themselves feral. They would say, this is where I'm from, this is how we do it, and all those kind of things. And that's true. That's true in urban settings here in America. You look at...
It certainly is.
Yeah. A place like Detroit.
As a cop, I worked in areas where I would say you don't have a failed state, you don't have a failed city, but you may have failed neighborhoods.
Yeah.
I've spent many years working in what some people would call the ghetto. I find that to be a rich, vibrant place with lots of vitality, lots of people, that are resilient, bringing positive social goods to the community. And that's the case in the slums in Africa. You could look and say, I wrote a paper, Global Cities, Global Slums, and building upon the work of Mike Davis on Planet of Slums. Slums can be negative, because live in poverty, they have public health challenges, there are security challenges, but they also demonstrate the resiliency of people who are able to overcome those, and basically maybe showing the future of how you negotiate climate crisis and instability crisis. I think where it becomes scary is when you see the convergence of insecurity of a variety of types. Like if you go to parts of Central Africa, you'll get the Ebola outbreak that may be spanning borders. You have humanitarian aid workers that are being challenged by gangsters on the ground,
Right.
that are exacerbating the health situation, that are destabilizing the government, could move beyond. That's a scary proposition. How do you provide the intelligence support to understand who to go with, who to negotiate with? And to make it even more complicated, depending upon where the military operates, you're going to operate in an international armed conflict, or you're going to operate in a non-international armed conflict. And in some places, you're going to have multiple non-international armed conflicts layered together, clustered together with an international armed conflict. And who do you negotiate with? I mean, obviously, the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, apply to everybody in all of those situations. But how do you instantiate that? How do you effectively negotiate? There are cases where you can negotiate, and it has been done, with violent non-state actors. And some will, in fact, agree to follow the rules. In fact, that's a desirable situation. But, bringing those skill sets together is difficult.
I want to make it even more complicated and then kick it right over to John Spencer, because he can handle anything. So, John, you hear all the things that Dr. Sullivan's talking about.
Yeah.
And then you add in the intel myopia, right, where everything becomes a threat. I walk into a tactical operations center, and as a guy that deals in the ground truth, I don't see the ground truth. I see us looking for, this person and that person, and we don't find these people in over a year. And to Dr. Sullivan's case too, also, like as law enforcement, we'll have people we're looking for, but we can't even put in a successful case against a lot of these people that we know are bad actors out there. So we see everything as a threat, and it might just be crime. It might just be survival, but that's not how we see it. So we push this force together. And I know a number of people that have had their hands on lethal targeting packages for people that turned out are part of that community resilience. Let me add another element into this. And I want us to account for it, because it is part of what a lot of us see in the coming future of instability is global climate change and the rising seas. And then the overall ability for anybody to wage war. Like, war has really been democratized in a lot of ways. Anybody can go onto Amazon, buy a drone, and have I'm doing quoting fingers, an air force of sorts. So given all that, trying to get to the root of these problems, is there a nexus? Is there a point? Is there a singularity in this problem set? Because what we're describing is something that's three-dimensionally complex.
Yeah, nice softball, Pete. From what we're talking about so far, I still think there's what blows my mind, and sometimes you gotta actually go visit these places.
Good point.
Is the scale of what we're talking about, where you have neighborhoods that are in the millions. So just like John says, you have a functioning city that has all the global connections to the world, but you go to that city, name a really big city, Rio, New York City, Dhaka, and you're going to know from being on the ground quickly that there's major portions of it that are night and day once you cross a line. And that night and day is power sharing, how the services are rendered, everything. But I think we all have I almost think it's a Western mindset. And, as somebody who's kind of been rewired after the military, or right towards the end of my military, we do have this Western mindset of wanting to control something. So if you're in the military, you want to control the environment. We might say we want to shape the environment, but our intention is to control it. And same thing if you go to U.S. government, we're talking about a country, diplomatic relations, all that. The interest is always to control the situation and achieve your interest. when you talk about the complexity of these urban spaces, there is no control. It's understand, manage. There's some flows that, pre-existing flows that are multi-layered. I mean, the power one's probably the easiest, to discuss, but it's everything. It's how, how the garbage system works in a major city. It's all, it's not controlled, it's managed. So when we talk about power, like you were talking about, we did it, for 10, 15 years in Baghdad, where we're, policing up bad guys that were vital nodes in different power streams. And you upset that. And they did it to us. Just like, when you don't understand the environment, then you can be co-opted for somebody else's intention. So, we did this. We'd police up bad guys that we had intel on that was given to us. And it's actually now, that's just conflicting two power structures within an individual neighborhood. And he's using you to get the other guy out of there. So one of them, it's a Western mindset of control rather than understand. And I've written a lot about, how would you understand some of these environments differently? In it, after the fight for Mosul, General Townsend, who was the U.S. representative to the Mosul fight, said, "If I've gained anything from that
This episode of the Break It Down Show is brought to you by Lions Rock Productions.
That's us.
We publish, evaluate, and develop podcasts just like this one, consult others to build their own, and create associated content and content marketing strategies.
So if you're launching or expanding your social media presence, your business or your personal brand, or if you just want to take your media presence to the next level,
reach out to us on Twitter
at P. Turner
or at JohnLG69
at the Break It Down Show.
There's 1,000 ways to get a hold of us.
Now enjoy the show.
Mosul fight said, if I've gained anything from that is I would add power to our intel network of understanding an environment.
Yeah.
Because we think we get it by going political, military, police, all this, but that's not analysis of power.
Right.
Because power can be grandma. I mean, grandma in a neighborhood could have immense power, and the tribal system gives us an analogy to look at it.
And you see that in Dan's movie with that two-time widowed woman who's a warrior.
Yeah, and I saw it. And you kind of go from, you stumble upon it. You live in a neighborhood for long enough, and John, lived this life. It takes you a long time to understand how power is managed and isn't controlled, but how the flows are so varied. And we have a problem with the scale of it, in the scale of people, power, everything in some of these urban environments where conflict will happen. So I think it's the thought of control, and then the not understanding of power, and that's just something that we can focus on for the moment. And you mentioned about war being democratized. Yeah, so the scholar in me and the teacher of this stuff to cadets will say, war by definition is nation states trying to achieve their political objective. Warfare is fighting. So war, I still think is still in the realm of nation states. Wage war, and that's why we, U.S. we have our own definitions. I actually got asked a really hard question the other day on a different interview, where he said, how do you understand if an urban area is a combat zone? And that, to me, that was really hard, because you asked me as a military guy, Baghdad was a combat. You deployed me as a military force to achieve political objectives in an urban area. It was a combat zone.
Yeah.
If you live in Baghdad, you don't live in you don't think you live in a combat zone. Even if you're the politicians, you're dealing with crime, insurgency, things like that, but you don't consider yourself a combat zone.
How about this? I talked to Shaka Senghor, who grew up in Detroit, and he said, prison is an extension of my community, and every male I know has been shot, and a lot of them are dead. And he talked about getting off the X. That sounds like Detroit is a combat zone.
No, I think it's for many cops, I won't, let's ask John that. I think conflict has been democratized, and but not war.
Man, John, I agree. Defining what war is and how that diverges from warfare is again, it's a fluid concept. War was not always fought by nation states, because political arrangements weren't always aligned around nation states. There were feudal entities,
city states,
city-states, empires. I would argue that a lot of what we're seeing in non-international armed conflict now, or the crime wars or criminal insurgencies, would not be a surprise to Caesar. He would have understood it. He would have seen it. If you look back to that classical era, those are useful kind of vantage points. So it depends on where you are. I would say there is a great danger in viewing warfare and insurgency and crime and the convergence only through the eyes of there's a threat that we have to contain. And I'll tell you that as a cop. I've worked in rough neighborhoods. I've supervised, I've responded. You have to remember, going back to Jane Jacobson cities, a city is a living entity, a living organism in a lot of ways as a metaphor. And it has flows that you have to understand. Yep. And when the police roll into a city in a militarized view, and it's why people are afraid of militarized policing, not that there aren't very many common things. My training and your training are remarkably similar, particularly when you get to command level, that the public and politicians, frankly, don't recognize. And that's because that's not their job. We don't exactly know what they do either. But when you understand how to provide the intelligence, I mean, you have to, in first step, you have to immerse yourself in the situation. You have to understand the flows of power. I mean, Norton, going back to the feral city, in his definition, he looked at a couple of different metrics. He looked at governance, which is really the power, or, what Cohen might call the conflict ecology, and who's, the competitive control for that power, the economy. And you could say there's a illicit economy, there's a criminal black market illicit economy, and in reality, there's a gray economy where the two merge, and that's where a lot of the activity occurs. And cops aren't designed to deal with that kind of nuance as well as I would like to see. You look at services, who provides the service. You look at Mexico, there are humanitarian relief coming from the cartel. Yep. Even cartels that people thought were hyper violent, like the Zetas, and didn't see them as having any interest in maintaining legitimacy in the community. They, in fact, see the need to have legitimacy in the community. They provided utilitarian, no doubt, but utilitarian social control, humanitarian aid after disasters. Security. Who provides security? Well, clearly, gangsters of various types provide security, informal justice systems in their area, just like they, extortion is a form of tax. And, the final dimension Norton had was civil society. What were the relationships between the range of non-governmental actors, private voluntary organizations, churches, community organizations, the big global NGOs, and the state and the militaries that function there? And going back to the intel, I mean, I spent a lot of time walking the beat, supervising and managing people who walk the beat, and seeing the bonds between the community and the police here in the United States erode to the point where there was a lack of confidence. And I think one of the ways you deal with that is understand it, train in it, and train at all levels. A lot of the times, and I suspect it's the same in the military, and it's been with a lot of the discussions I've had over the last 20 years or so, is people see this as a tactical issue. Can we kick the door down better? Can we better engage at the checkpoint? And, and we figured that stuff out quick. In fact, I would argue most of the cops I know, you don't need to train them on that because they learn to get good at it, just like the gangsters. Gangsters do get formal training increasingly, sometimes by getting co-opted former cops, former military folks. In fact, they recruit them into the situations, specifically in places like Brazil and Mexico. But the tactical stuff you learn yourself. If you don't become tactically adept, you die. That's the reality in both of our professions. Where the real difficulty comes is how you get to that. Well, two difficulties. One is the strategic vision to know we're going to be operating in cities in the future, and how you deal with those emerging power structures. Because it's not just conflict. The economy, the flow of information is growing in the urban area, and we're going to have urban, geopolitics emerge. But the real challenge, and this is where I think it gets difficult, especially for the police, is the operational lever. How do you synchronize tactical, multiple tactical operations over time and space, campaigns into the strategy, that operational level of maneuver or theater level of maneuver? And, frankly, it's a place like Los Angeles, Lagos, Johannesburg, Hong Kong, you name the mega city of the future. They're basically theaters. They're operational theaters on their own. And how do you actually synchronize multiple operational theaters below the level of global geostrategy? Do we have a command structure that understands that? Do we have a senior NCO corps and warrant officers and officers that know how to do that? And do we war game to understand that range? And the last thing I'll hear, and I'll turn it back hopefully to John to get your reaction, is how do you sync the military and police operations? Because crime doesn't go away when the military comes in. We saw that in Bosnia. The gangsters, found a way to exploit the military operation and the seams in society between that to their personal benefit and the detriment of many of the people on the ground.
Yeah, before we kick it over to John, because I do want to hear what you think about that. Has someone successfully put together an Euler diagram to kind of describe all of the stuff that you just talked about there at all, Dr. Sullivan? Or is there not something like that? Because it's such a complex thing. It seems like an Euler diagram would be perfect to try to at least start to understand what we were looking at.
I don't think there is one, and I've seen the ones that were built by a lot of the planning staff in Iraq, and they're complicated. People get confused. People make jokes about them. When you look at them, they make great sense. But to boil it down to a very simple way, there isn't one. But I think there are keys. The military, IPB, intelligence preparation of the battlefield or battle space.
Yeah.
I call intelligence preparation for operations. For that reason that people living in LA don't want to believe they live in a battlefield.
Right.
The functions are the same. I did a lot of work in the late 90s through the mid 2000 to about 2010 on intelligence preparation for operations. Drew upon a lot of the work done at RAND on urban IPB, work by like Russ Glenn and Jameson Joe Medby, who's over at the UN now looking at this on a kind of global sense. On taking that 4-step process for IPB and translating it into a civil military interface and then adding other pieces. So there's some pieces on how you would do the intel flow, and I think I have some really good work there. But looking at all the social political connectivity, there's not one place, there are multiple places. And I think to fuse them into one doctrine would be real complicated. In fact, when I took the IPB 4 steps and built the model for intelligence preparation of operations and would train it, people would say, man, it looks like an eye chart because there are many pieces there. You could drill down. In fact, I'll tell you that one chart. Now, I could share it to you by email later. I briefed the one chart for 2 days, just the one chart. Could you drill down into all the pieces and how it goes and talk through while helping build an intelligence fusion center at a major city in the U.S. And actually, I did that about 56 jurisdictions around the U.S. when I was helping build the fusion center process. So I think there are ways to look at the intel process. There are ways, as Norton and Bunker and I have modeled out what a feral city looks like. There's some of that. Some of how the threat actors, how gangs and cartels evolve and merge. We've laid those out to put them in one mega diagram and then add all the complexities of urban operations would be really difficult. I think that's why you almost need specialists that understand urban operations and the contingencies, the range of contingencies, from Stalingrad to Londanistan, Mumbai. I call the policing piece of it a full spectrum policing. You have to be able to go from community policing, which is the foundation, on through counter drug, counter gang, into formed stability policing units that are arranged like an infantry squad, right? Multiple infantry squads. Cops aren't trained to do that. Conversely, the military isn't designed to break it down to the other direction.
I want to give the mic to John real quick here, but I have to ask one more follow-up question on that then. So then how, within our Euler diagram that we can't even begin to start to create, there will be a Venn diagram that illustrates the overlap between criminal activity and combat activity. How much do those spheres cross over?
It depends on where you are and there's a conflict you're in.
Yeah,
but they certainly converge. There's certainly an overlap between crime war. And I think that's the real difficulty is, to deal with these. And you see it when in complex humanitarian emergencies, a global pandemic would bring you there. Terrorism certainly brings an overlap, but the intensity varies. To deal with these, it's not just the cops and it's not just the military. It's a whole of government approach that's needed to deal with this. I mean, that's always been seen in counterinsurgency, diplomatic, intelligence, military, economic. And I argued in the early 2000s, we needed to add, to that dime, a P, policing. Because, policing is an important piece. But the police, when you go into domestic counterterrorism, you can't just look for the bad guy. You have to work with the fire service to be able to prepare to respond when the inevitable attack occurs, because you're never going to prevent them all, despite statements, otherwise that's our goal. It is our goal, but it's impossible. You have to manage the conflict. You have to bring in the public health service and medics to deal with that. But you need, once the World Trade Center went down, you needed construction companies and cranes. Right? So there's a civil military operation. There's a military policing interface that is ongoing, and you can't just build it the day the battle comes. You have to build that beforehand. You have to have confidence. John and I have read our work together, and we've spoken together over time. We could probably interoperate and work. Yeah. But if we never spoke before and we got on the ground, we walk in, he's going to look at me, I'm going to look at him. My uniform says one thing, his says another. Our rank structures don't even have direct correlation. How do we know how to do it?
John, it's finally your turn.
Nice. So the number one thing I think that comes out of all of this is it takes PhD level works to understand one attribute of this conversation. Yeah. And that's one. What I always tell people, and I get my laugh, is that's job security for me, is the fact that there are no specialists out there. But just like the population and urbanization figures should be mind-blowing, it should be mind-blowing that we don't have urban experts. So by experts, I mean urban spectrum of conflict experts. So you need an urban warfare expert, so military operations and urban terrain. There are no experts. You need military security experts, and that's everything from policing to how the terrain is actually used to secure against threats. It's mind-blowing that me and John Sullivan can name out probably the list of no less than 10 people that are experts in an attribute of this, which is great for us. I love it. It's job security for me for foreseeable future. Mind-blowing that there is no U.S.-based academic institution dedicated to the study of conflict in urban areas. There's one in Britain that I know of, and there's a couple that kind of touch it in different aspects. There's no U.S. Army urban anything school that teaches anything other than entering, clear a room and shooting, about understanding these environments like we're talking about. Back to some of our other conversations. So one, I'm not a grammar Nazi. War on drugs, crime wars. I'm not I will not fall on my sword on the use of the term war, and I think it's contextual in what the conversation, as long as we're both understanding what we're talking about. For sure, there are a lot of places around the world that are war zones that had nothing to do with the nation states, and places that I wouldn't want to go. John mentioned the thing about police training, and I think I've told you before, Pete, and you understand the ground truth. In my 2 deployments of Iraq, outside of the first month of the invasion, the only thing I was doing was policing. You can, I'm in a military uniform. I'm doing security operations. I'm doing community. I'm trying to do community-based, but hell, I don't understand the community. So military forces being asked to do police actions without any training is the trend that we've used in the past, and I can tell you why that is, and why do nations build militaries and what's the purpose of them, all the way down to Iraq not wanting to use the military for internal security, but they had to. I was doing policing, especially in Baghdad, and I had no clue what I was doing. I was just making stuff up, with all good intentions.
Sure.
And also understanding the security environment in which you are in is going to be completely different. In Iraq, they don't do community policing. you trying to get a cop to walk the beat in Baghdad wasn't going to happen.
No.
They do centralized policing, as in they set up a police headquarters and they expect you to come to them with their problems, and they'll respond to emergencies, but they're not going to walk the beat and get to know each other. The gangs that we coerced, the Sons of Iraq, were more like that, as we took people from the neighborhoods, put them on checkpoints, and they knew about their neighborhoods. That's more of that model. But the urban IPB, I think, is great, but it goes back to the specialist. And I just wrote a piece about, if you want to understand a city, which city, especially these big ones, if you don't develop a specialist in each city, then you're never going to understand it. So we have we still have like we've been saying, a nation state, a country concept. The entire U.S. government deploys what's called country teams into countries, and they interact with their counterparts, and they understand the country. They could be deep inside of a megacity and have no clue on how that megacity works. And we've ran into that, where we visited country team and asked more specific questions about the city in itself, and they don't know. So we need same thing with our foreign, our foreign area officers, a very big program in the military, where we dedicate military personnel to understand a country and everything about it. And they go to school, they learn the language. We have nothing like that for any city. And that's mind-blowing, because the cities are who we are. I mean, economically, diplomatically, cities have more power than nations in lots of places around the world. Cities control the global economy, not nation. I mean, the nation states make the decision, but 300 of the world's largest cities control 70% or output 70% of the global GDP. 300 cities.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's mind blowing. So the specialist thing is, you asked for the diagram.
Yeah,
we need whether it's even it's all the way down to the tactical level of doing a military operation in a city, whether that's to do a regime change in the capital city, whether that's to cut a cancer out, which, cutting the cancer out of a city without destroying the city is what we've seen in the last 10 years, right? Name a city: Aleppo, Raqqa, Tal Afar, Fallujah. The operation that we've asked people to do is to go in and reclaim the city and cut a cancer out. Yeah. There's no study of that. There's no school that's dedicated to that, no military planners dedicated to that operation. And that should be mind-blowing.
Well, and I'll amplify that, because I've written on the lack of doctrinal training and then any kind of significant capacity in transition operations. We talk about, in the case of coin, clearing, building, and holding, but yep. Like, no shit, like, how do we leave? and that stuff is extremely complex, because you have to accept that the Iraqis are going to police the way they police. They're yep. not going to do it the way we do it. And who says the way that we do it is better than their method, So there's all these aspects of transition. So you go to cut the cancer out, and then there's no aftercare. You just leave this person with this, hey, there's no cancer in that body anymore. Walk away. And
I will say, so I didn't remember that. I want to mention that whole, there have been models in history where the military kind of moves in to conduct the operation, and they're followed by a police force. Mm-hmm. And we've seen some of that lately, where it's not as publicized, but we've learned some of those lessons. Take Raqqa, for example. You liberate Raqqa, and then they immediately fund a kind of a civil defense force to maintain some level of security, whether they're considered not legitimate, but they're considered, they're accepted by the people is another question. But what you're talking about, along this spectrum of conflict, that stability phase, all that. And I actually was just had a conference where the whole U.S. national stability doctrine, or they don't call it doctrine, has been recently put out about the sharing relationships of. So the same thing when I'm talking about urban, there's no Department of State urban experts.
Yeah.
There's nobody who can rebuild. There's no experts on rebuilding cities. But the word urban, the cities and things like this don't appear in our national defense strategy. They don't appear in our national stability doctrine. But you need to get that specific, and us urban guys know that.
Yeah.
If you're going to do any of these things, you need to be specific urban, and then you need to be specific to that urban site, even if it's a city. And all of these definitions kind of start to confuse each other. I like, I'm a ground truth kind of guy. So I like to have it. You even ask me the question, what is a city?
Yeah.
And then you'll get a million answers.
Yeah. We had a guy on the show named Bill Mankins, and he's working on this problem also. And he's trying to develop capacity by focusing on creating basically all the way up to a PhD track in special operations, because the compression of authority and skill over time, what we expect out of a 22-year-old lieutenant or a 23-year-old, E6, E7 is incredible given what we give them to prepare themselves. We ask a lot of them on the fly, simultaneously switching between humanitarian, policing, and combat operations in the same 2-minute period. Like it's crazy. And we have not.
I was just talking to Microsoft a couple of days ago, and the promise of AI in helping in these complex problem solving situations, right? So we mentioned, the not knowing how kind of an urban situation happened before, but you have the guy on the ground truth, the guy on the ground that you expect to do these things, and what are you giving him? So you're going to train him, right? So we all know how that's going to be, but
right.
I do think artificial intelligence is promising if you acknowledge your personnel management system, right? So me and you know the ground truth that you got a guy who just came in. He's been through this limited training. He's rotating out. If you're talking about a squad, platoon, division, how many new people you have there that are really OJT in their job. But could artificial intelligence be one of the aids in knowledge management that it cues you to information that you may need at that moment in time without conducting cognitive overload?
Sure.
It's really good stuff to talk, and it's pretty fascinating what we can already do. But I'm the ground truth guy going, don't give that to a private. Don't give that to Don't give that to a sergeant. You're just going to overload him, and you might get him killed because he's looking at your HoloLens screen while somebody's shooting at him.
Let me just say this, and then I'm going to kick it over to Dr. Sullivan. And clearly our agenda has been shot to shit because we're already at an hour. But one of the things that because I'm a ground truth guy, just like John Spencer, any number of times I was asked by the military, how many mosques, how many schools, in this region. And then I got to the point where I no longer, like, you can't keep asking the same fucking question year after year. Like, either you know this shit or you don't. And if you don't know that, why are you operating? And then the answer to that question always was, who asked the question? Oh, it's the guy partnered with the governor in that area. Okay. The answer to your question is ask your partner. Because
so my favorite one of my favorite sci-fi books, is called Old Man's War, where you take kind of old people and put them in new bodies, but then you give them an AI in their brain.
Yeah.
And then you're able to ask the AI the dumb questions that you don't want to ask, that you need to know. And the character he actually names his AI asshole. So he's just sitting there by himself and you're like, hey, asshole, what's the answer to this?
Yeah.
That's the level I think what we do now in the Google, we just pick up our phone and Google it. In combat, I've said the same thing. We think we know what we need to know, and that's IPB, right?
Yeah.
And we think that once you cross the line of departure, we know the things we already need to know.
Yeah.
That's not I'm on the ground and I need to know where the nearest crane is.
Yeah.
So I can do something. I need to know where the nearest bulldozer is.
Yeah.
And if I had Google War, I would be able to get that answer. We don't give our soldiers Google War, although it's capable today.
Yeah. Dr. Sullivan, we killed an hour just like that.
Oh, you kill him weak.
Yeah.
Yeah, we could kill a long time.
But this goes to the complexity, fellas, of what we're talking about. And we never even touched on climate change. And look, some people are going to dismiss that as not being a significant factor. Some people are going to reject that. The fact is that even before we get to climate change, the complexity of the exchange of power under whatever means you want to call it, it's not something that anybody knows enough to be an authority. And fellas, I don't use full spectrum anymore. I talk spherical spectrum because it's just.
I can see that.
Yeah, because it's how wide is this spectrum going to be? Is it going to be a belt around my entire waist? That's going to be a big belt, So we have to think spherically about these problems, or cubically, or in a three-dimensional matrix, something like that, because it's hard. And then when the ground truth guy, here comes here comes John Spencer walking up. How does he have any credibility with the people he's about to engage with as you intersect these different, the police trainer in the area or, the battle space owner, just the time I would spend studying ourselves overseas and gaining access to the meetings and the influencers I needed to talk to be able to get the military to stop making big mistakes. It took more than half of my time, No,
I do know. And I spent a couple decades trying to figure out how to do that civil military between different public safety agencies. And I'll confess, I still haven't figured out how to bridge the world. But part of it is IPB. That's one of the reasons we called it intelligence preparation for operations. When I broke out a concept for doing it in the domestic public safety space for counterterrorism and other complex emergencies, intelligence preparation doesn't stop the minute you get into the kind of the trans-incident, post-incident phase. It continues. Intelligence is an ongoing process. It has to be embedded in all your decision support at all levels of maneuver. It's not just intelligence for the commander. And it's not just what most cops do, intelligence for case support to put the bad guy in and build the case. It's providing an ongoing understanding of those adapting situations. And part of the way, you can model in a lot of ways. One of it is current intelligence is situational awareness, right? We're going to get something coming down the line. We'll call it early warning because we want to get there, which makes a lot of sense. When we go further out, we're talking strategic foresight. The reality is you can't just compartmentalize. You have to do all those simultaneously. When I ran my Intel Fusion shop, I always broke my shop up into current and future operations. I mean, I had change the weight depending upon what was happening. If you're a firefight, you can do more current than future, right? But you need to know as you're supporting that there's that spectrum of activity. One way to do that is you have to have ops intel fusion. It's not just intelligence fusion, it's ops intel fusion, and the two have to work each other. And as I think all three of us has realized, if you don't have an awareness of the logistic chain, it doesn't really matter because you're not going to have anything to do it with. So you need to pull those together. So basically what you're doing is you're talking about a team of leaders to take from the special operations world, a tactical liaison team to go in and see what's happening. There's good stuff. Like the Marine Corps has a really nice generic intelligence requirements handbook. I still look at it from time to time. It's comprehensive. The reality is if you hand that to a corporal and say, you're in a 3-block war, you're now a strategic corporal, and Krulak was right. You need to do that. That's what a beat cop does ideally. Although I'll tell you, it takes him 30 years in his career to figure out how to actually do it. Then you're retired.
Yeah, it's more like a 10-block war now, too.
No, of course. Because there's not multiple simultaneous, but it's a team of leaders you have to bring there. It's a team of intelligence people. It's engagement. The police-military interface, the need for that isn't new. The Marine Corps spent the bulk of the latter 19th century doing that. The constabulary in Haiti. The Army did it in the Philippines, the Philippine Constabulary. They did it in Europe after World War II. World War II wasn't a cut VE day and then it's over. There was 10 years of civil strife and political complexity that followed that it took a while to contain. After the engagements in the Balkans, they realized that you needed a police component. The French were configured real well because they had a gendarmerie. They were able to infuse that because they were part of the armed forces, a kind of a third force that, a foreign police force. The Europeans, recognizing that value, went ahead and built the European Gendarmerie Force, a composite force to do EU expeditionary operations. The Australians do expeditionary policing. The New South Wales Police, the Australian Federal Police were in Papua New Guinea. But how many people here in the United States can do that kind of civil-military interoperability? Not as many as we'd like. Now, obviously, there are Guard members who are dual-hatted. I had Marine Corps colonels in the reserves working on my staff. Before the Iraq War came, we used those informal relationships to bring in guys from the MU to come train with my intel guys and counter gang guys to understand what they would be doing when they got to Baghdad and Mosul and on the line. Informal crash courses built on relationships. We have those informal relationships that we've been developing among the people that do urban stuff. John, Major Spencer, you're absolutely right. You don't feel the military as a pickup softball team. Not if you want to prevail and shape the environment and not just have it shape you. And that's why I think your advocacy of wanting to build an urban warfare school makes great sense. All I'd say, and we've kind of batted this around, is expand it beyond the Army, bring in the other whole of government players, the other military forces. The littoral space is still, the Australians call it the worst of two worlds, the urban fight and the littoral fight coming together. And most of those cities are on the coast.
So we're getting ready to have a space force. We may have a cyber force soon, but for some reason we don't think we need an urban force.
Yeah, and we absolutely need a space and cyber force. I mean, those are significant areas to account for. And I know it's funny to make fun of the president for suggesting a space force, but talk to anybody who works in the commercial side of space and what they see coming. And you have to have some ability to enforce the international agreements that were made before a space force was ever possible. Everybody promises to be on their best behavior, but who trusts everybody to do that? The other thing I wanted to bring up, and then really we're going to close out of this thing, is we talked about future ops, current ops, and what often isn't seen are the past ops and partner ops. Being able to understand how, like, okay, we have this assumption. This is an example from the field. We're going to paint the government center, and that's going to make people appreciate the government more and draw them closer to it. Past ops goes out and goes, fail. That we can't find a trace of anybody caring that the government center was painted. And then matrixing and analyzing the partner ops, like what are they capable of doing? Can we see supplies flow from a request going up to supplies being given down, all of that stuff, so you can identify within a system, like where is the system breaking down, and then applying help there. We don't ever talk about that. And how can you expect it? If you just constantly do future ops, and you just go, you're just going to accomplish X number of things with no real discernible and provable impact. I can promise you I can go back to anywhere I went in Iraq and I can find little, if any, trace of any positive legacy from any of the units that I served with. And there's a lot of units.
Yeah. So honestly, Pete, I think we've surpassed, especially in urban areas and the complexity of urban, we've surpassed human capability.
Yeah.
What we're asking them to do. So I do think that the machine human teaming, just in decision making, has to be the key to the future. You and I have talked about this. Just knowing, like, hey, don't ask that question again, because the last 10 guys before you asked that question, and you're really pissing off the guy when you keep asking that question.
Yeah.
But we have no system, like I've written about. There's no knowledge management, let alone an AI that can not only hold knowledge, but then give you an answer that's not just giving you knowledge, but he's done the analysis for you. And
when those systems do exist, because we do try to have reach back capability, it's OBE, overcome by events. It's too slow.
Yep. I need to write that, but we need Google War. We've surpassed human capabilities. Even if you develop an expert in something, we're still surpassing by the complexity in these environments of a single action and knowing the second and third order effects of who you're talking to, what you're doing, your rotation of people. I'm a big proponent on we have to start looking at other ways to do it rather than training an individual in a short amount of time and asking them to do something in this especially this urban environment, whether that's policing, military action, whatever. It has to be enabled by modern science, really.
Well, when you write that piece, let me know. I'd love to do a co-author credit on that with you, because there's so much to cover.
Right. Yeah.
We didn't even get out of the first point on our bullet point, what we were going to get into. But I think we spent a lot of time accurately describing the complexity of the situation and where the capacity to even move forward in these things. I mean, we're talking about, future warfare and current warfare. And it's what we know is that we just need a lot more capacity and professional capability to apply these things. And then collaboration, when I see Dr. Sullivan rock in the room, I'm going to be like, who the fuck is that? Doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not been there. And I've never even met the man, but that is the normal thing. When Pete walks in the room, no one expects me to know anything, so I have to overcome our own bias internally. And if we can struggle to do that, how the heck are we going to overcome whoever the enemy or the co-belligerents are in the area if we can barely get along ourselves, you know?
Can I just add one follow-on to
Please.
that? That's a real challenge. I first faced that in the 92 riots when one meth came up to LA and we're going to use their normal plans, and they quickly realized they needed to set up liaison officers and couple cops with officers to figure out how to do their mission planning. When I started putting together the counterterrorism response capability here in LA, the standard I set for my staff was you're not going to brief off of PowerPoints. You're not going to rely on the generic requirement handbook. We're going to send you to multiple trainings. You're going to do multiple evolutions. You're going to go off and respond to other emergencies, other places, do exercises. And my measure of success for you is when you walk up to the commander of a special mission unit, when you do that MET-T, he knows you know.
Yeah.
The way you do that is friendly force intelligence. You learn how to translate between the different worlds. You can't use military terms in policing every day. You can't use U.S. military terms with British cops every day. We'll get each other confused. But when you work together and you understand and know how to talk and know the capacity of your forces you bring to bear and know the force structure you're going to put together for that specific operation, that's what police watch commanders do. That's what Bradley did in the European theater 70 years ago. But how do you build that capacity in an ongoing base? And I'll go back to that team and leader. I think Major Spencer is right. AI is there, but we have to be careful that we don't build the wrong bias into that decision algorithm or that support algorithm, or we're going to have problems.
Yeah.
So the first step is kind of where we are now. Let's start to define the parameters of the space, and little by little work on the process. And it's going to be an ongoing thing because cities aren't going to be static. We're not going to be fighting in Stalingrad. And Stalingrad today isn't what it was then.
Yeah, that's why I like the Google war analogy. I agree. Just the ethical attributes of building something that's going to give you a decision that's going to be potentially lethal force. But just the ability to ask a question that it's just somebody's putting all the knowledge into a system, and you can ask a question that'll give you that piece of knowledge. And Pete, Afghanistan, Iraq, you name it.
Yeah.
Just to be able to ask the question or to have some predictive analysis. We tried it with something called TigerNet to know that the street you're driving down this has happened on that street. And there's no decision being given to you, but it's just giving you the information that you'll never know with the way you're rotating people out, or even your lifetime.
Yeah.
To know that something in the 1950s happened right here on this spot, and this is the reason. If I have a parting shot, Pete, if at that time, I give you a parting shot. So if you look, we're trying to predict 20, 30, 10 years out from now, war, for me, warfare, things that are important. Let's go back in time and go 10, 15 years ago. Was urban the thing? John was right. The Marines in the 90s did Project Metropolis after, Mogadishu. And there's a big urban focus because we had no knowledge management. All that stuff was lost. And now we have round 2 happening right now. I wouldn't say all lost, but it gets lost. But 10 years ago, if you would tell me that every genesis of armed conflict had an urban underlayer to it, I would tell you that you're crazy. We need to care about all environments, not just the urban. But if you look at today, if you dig deep enough, every conflict, whether it's water shortage, civil strife, and political instability based on mass population grievances, they all have an urban cause. So if you don't believe that every conflict in the near future is going to have an urban underpinning, then you're just fooling yourself.